Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Please subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications. Now, let's dive into the story. The night Corinne Ashwell threw her son out of the house, the sky above Millhaven, Colorado, was the color of a bruise. Purple and yellow and threatening, the kind of sky that looks like it has already made up its mind about something. It was late October, 1962, and the wind coming down from the San Juan Mountains had teeth in it, biting through coat wool and shirt cotton like it had a personal grievance. The porch light threw a pale yellow rectangle across the front steps, and inside that rectangle stood Corinne, 51 years old, 5'4", wearing her good blue house dress because she had not yet changed after church, her grey-streaked hair pulled back so tightly it gave her face an expression of permanent severity, even when she wasn't feeling it. Tonight, she was feeling it. Her arms were crossed over her chest. Her jaw was set in the way that the people of Millhaven had learned, over 2 decades of knowing her, meant the conversation was already finished. The only thing left was the aftermath. Her son Decker stood on the porch with his suitcase at his feet. He had carried it down the stairs himself, which told you something about Corinne. She had not thrown him out dramatically, had not flung clothes from windows or screamed in the street. She had simply told him to pack what he needed for a while and put it by the door, and he had done it because even in the worst moments of his 22 years, Decker Ashwell had never been able to disobey his mother in a direct order. He was tall like his father had been, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair and the kind of face that women in Millhaven had been noticing since he was 17. He was also pale tonight, pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, standing on the porch with his hands loose at his sides and looking at Corinne with an expression that was equal parts guilt and disbelief, and something underneath both of those that was pure, raw grief. The grief of a person who has just understood that they have broken something that may not be fixable. "Mama," he said, just that. Just the one word. The way you say a word when there are too many others behind it and no clear path through them. Corinne looked at him with her arms crossed and her jaw set and said nothing for a long count of 5. The wind moved through the old cottonwood in the front yard and shook its last brown leaves loose and sent them skipping across the porch boards between them. The porch light flickered once. Inside the house, a clock ticked. The silence was the loudest thing on the street. Then Corinne said, in a voice so level it was almost worse than shouting, "You know what you did. You know what this means for that girl. And you know what I raised you to be. And it wasn't this." She uncrossed one arm and pointed at the road. Not the town. Not the distance. The road itself, the cracked asphalt strip that ran through Millhaven and kept going into the dark beyond the streetlights. "Come back when you've made it right," she said. Not before. She stepped back inside and closed the door. The sound of that door was not a slam. A slam would have been easier. It would have had anger in it, and anger is a thing you can argue with, push back against, survive by fighting. This sound was a quiet, final click. The sound of a decision made completely. Decker stood on the porch and looked at the closed door, and at the dark rectangle of window beside it, and at the cottonwood shaking in the cold wind, and he picked up his suitcase. He stood there a moment longer. Just a moment, with his hand on the handle, and his breath making small clouds in the October air, looking at the house he had grown up in, at the porch he had sat on every summer evening of his childhood, at the door behind which his mother was now standing, in her good blue dress, in the silence of a house that had always been, more than anything, hers. He thought about knocking. He did not knock. He walked down the 3 porch steps and out to the road and turned left, which was the direction of town, and kept walking, and the porch light clicked off behind him like a period at the end of a sentence, and what had been said between them in that October dark was not yet finished, not by a long measure, but neither of them knew that yet. What they both knew in the shivering quiet of that Colorado night was that something had changed forever. What neither of them knew yet was what it was going to cost them before it was through. The girl's name was Sarah Voss, and she was already 4 months along. To understand what Corinne Ashwell did on that October night, you have to understand what she had built and what it had cost her. Millhaven. Colorado sat in the shadow of the San Juan Mountains, like something that had been set down carefully and then forgotten. A town of 412 people, 1 main street, a feed store, a diner, a church with a leaning steeple, and the particular self-consciousness of a small place that knows the world is not watching and has complicated feelings about that. Corinne had come to Millhaven as a bride at 23, following her husband, Garrett Ashwell, who had grown up there and had inherited his father's small cattle operation on 40 acres east of town. Garrett was a gentleman, a steady man, a man who fixed things quietly and never raised his voice, and died of a heart attack behind the wheel of his pickup truck on a Tuesday morning in April, when Decker was 11 years old, leaving Corinne with the 40 acres, $200 in savings, a cattle operation that needed 3 men to run and now had none, and a son young enough to need everything and old enough to understand that something had gone deeply, permanently wrong. She had not fallen apart. This was the thing about Corinne that Millhaven talked about for years afterward. Not with admiration exactly, but with the particular complicated respect that people give to someone who refuses to do what they expect. She had buried Garrett on a Thursday, and on Friday morning she had put on her work clothes and gone out to the cattle. She had hired a hand named Burl Peterson, who was 60 years old and reliable and willing to work for what she could pay, which was not much. She had learned, over the following years, everything she did not already know about running a small cattle operation: the grazing rotation, the vet costs, the market timing, the hay purchase before winter, the endless repair of fence line and equipment, and the structures that the Colorado weather tried to dismantle every season. She had kept the 40 acres. She had not sold. She had not asked her brother in Denver for money, though he offered 3 times. She had not cried in public, not once, not in 11 years of widowhood. She was not a cold woman. Ask Burl Peterson, who had worked for her 15 years and would tell you she was the fairest and most decent employer he had ever had. She was not unfeeling. She simply believed, with the bone-deep conviction of a person who has been tested and has not broken, that what you show the world becomes what the world sees you as, and she had no intention of being seen as someone who could be knocked down. Into this world Decker had grown up, surrounded by his mother's discipline, her standards, her expectations delivered not as pressure, but as simple, obvious fact, the way the mountains to the west were fact. He was a good student, because Corinne sat with him at the kitchen table every evening until he understood what he had not understood. He worked the cattle alongside Burl from age 12 because Corinne believed work was the best education available, He was polite to adults and honest to a fault, and by the time he graduated high school at 18, he was the kind of young man that the mothers of Millhaven pointed out to their own sons as an example, which was the kind of distinction that made other boys dislike you slightly and respect you simultaneously. When Decker was accepted to the University of Colorado in Boulder, Corinne sat at the kitchen table with the acceptance letter and read it twice, carefully, and then looked up at her son and said, "Your father would have been proud." She did not say she was proud, but the way she held the letter told him everything. She sacrificed for that education in ways she never told him directly. A second mortgage on the 40 acres, taken quietly. The truck she drove for 3 more years past when it should have been replaced, nursing it through 2 Colorado winters on prayer and Burl's mechanical ingenuity. The church fundraiser she organized that everyone thought was for the community building fund and that she directed, in amounts too small to notice individually, toward Decker's tuition gap. She was not a woman who accepted charity, but she was a woman who understood the difference between asking for help and arranging for it invisibly. Decker went to Boulder in September of 1958, carrying 1 good suitcase and the weight of everything his mother had done to get him there. He was supposed to come back a man who justified all of it. He was supposed to come back as the proof that Corinne Ashwell's 20 years of holding everything together alone had not been wasted. He was supposed to come back with a degree and a future and his father's name on something worth having. He came back in the fall of 1962 with a letter from a girl named Sarah Voss that he had not had the courage to tell his mother about himself, and someone else had gotten there first. Sarah Voss had grown up 60 miles southwest of Millhaven in a town called Gunnison that was slightly larger and significantly colder, sitting at 8,000 feet in a valley that winter reached first and left last. She was the second daughter of Milo Voss, who ran a hardware store on Main Street with the focused intensity of a man who has decided that this one thing, managed correctly, will be enough. Her mother, Betsy Voss, was small and quietly funny, and made the best pie in Gunnison County, and had never once in Sarah's memory raised her voice in anger. Sarah had grown up between these two people, her father's seriousness and her mother's warmth, and had come out on the other side as something that was neither exactly a girl with her father's focused intelligence and her mother's instinct for other people, combined in a way that made her the kind of person who understood a room the moment she walked into it, who could see past what people said to what they meant, who laughed easily and worked hard and had opinions she was not afraid of. She had won a partial scholarship to the University of Colorado in 1959 and had arrived in Boulder with her mother's practical advice and her father's careful warnings and $120 in a savings account that was supposed to last a semester. She had met Decker Ashwell in the university library in October of her second year, both of them reaching for the same book on American land law, which was the kind of meeting that sounds constructed, but is simply what happens when 2 serious students are assigned the same reading in the same week. He had let her take the book. She had offered to share it. They had sat at the same table for 3 hours and discovered that they were both from small Colorado mountain towns, both the children of people who had worked hard for things that had not always lasted, and both slightly wary of the easy confidence of the city students around them who seemed to have come to university without the constant quiet awareness that someone back home had paid for this and was hoping. They had been friends first, genuinely, for nearly a year, before anything else, and Sarah would later think that this was both the best and the most complicated part of it, because the friendship had made them honest with each other in ways that romance alone rarely produces, and honest people make harder decisions and feel them more deeply when those decisions go wrong. She had not intended to fall in love with him. That was the truth of it. Set down plainly, without the decoration, people add to stories after the fact. She had not been looking for it, had in fact been somewhat wary of it, having watched several of her scholarship friends lose their academic footing in the particular gravitational field of romantic attachment. But Decker was different in the specific way that makes all the general wisdom useless. He was interested in her ideas, genuinely, in the way that was rare enough that she noticed it, and cautious enough about it, that she tested it 3 times before she believed it. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He disagreed with her occasionally in ways that were honest and respectful, and always made her think. When she told him about her father's hardware store and the particular pride and anxiety of being the first Voss to attend university, he had looked at her with recognition rather than pity and said, "My mother mortgaged the cattle land. She hasn't told me how much." They had sat with that shared weight between them and understood each other perfectly. This was the foundation. What grew on it was real. What went wrong on it was also real. That is the thing about real foundations. They do not make what is built on them automatic or safe. They just make the falling harder. The pregnancy was not planned. This is stated not as an excuse, but as a fact, because the difference matters. Sarah had been careful. Decker had been careful. Careful is not the same as impossible, and in the spring of 1962, possibility had arrived, with the quiet, disorienting certainty of a test result that you look at twice because you believe the first look must have been a mistake. She had sat in the small bathroom of her dormitory, holding a result she had not asked for, and felt the full, complicated weight of what it meant for a scholarship girl from Gunnison, who was 1 semester from graduating with honors, and a life plan that did not include this particular development. She had not panicked. She was not a person who panicked. She had gone to Decker. She had told him plainly, the way she told him everything. And to his credit, he had not run. He had gone pale, and then he had sat down, and then he had reached for her hand. "We figure this out together," he had said. The trouble was that figuring it out together had taken longer than they had, and by the time they had decided what they wanted to do, the decision had been made for them by 4 months of time, and the particular cruelty of small-town information networks. Someone from Gunnison had seen Sarah at a clinic in Denver. Someone from Gunnison had talked, and by the time the talk had crossed 60 miles of mountain road to Millhaven, it had grown, the way talk does, into something slightly larger and more definitive than the truth. Corinne Ashwell had heard it at church on a Sunday morning from the wife of the feed store owner, delivered with the particular expression of someone who believes they are doing you a favor. She had sat in the church pew for the remainder of the service with her hands folded and her face composed, and the information sitting in her chest like a coal. She had driven home. She had waited for Decker to arrive for his planned Sunday visit. And when he walked through the door at 2 in the afternoon, with his easy smile and his good, "Me what you haven't told me," and the way "me what you haven't told me," and the way his face moved when she said it, told her everything she needed to know before he spoke a single word. The morning after Decker left, Corinne got up at 5, the way she always did, and made coffee and put on her work clothes and went out to the cattle. The sky was pale grey, and the frost was thick on the fence wire, and the cattle moved in the far field in slow, steaming groups, their breath rising in white columns. Burl was already there, checking the water troughs, his old back bent at its permanent slight angle. He looked at her when she approached and said nothing, because Burl Peterson had worked for Corinne Ashwell for 15 years and had learned that there were mornings when she needed the work and the silence more than she needed anything else. She worked for 3 hours without speaking, more than the necessary words about the cattle, and when they came back to the barn at 8 to deal with the feed, Burl finally said, carefully, "Heard the boy left last night." Millhaven was 400 people. News moved like weather. Corinna said, "Yes." Burl said, "You all right?" She picked up a feed bucket. "I will be," she said. And Burl, who was 65 years old and had buried a wife and raised 3 sons, and knew what it looks like when a person is holding themselves together by the sheer force of routine, said nothing else and got to work beside her, which was the most useful thing he could have offered, and he knew it. What Corinne did not show Burl, what she did not show the town or the cattle or the grey Colorado morning, was the thing that had been happening in her chest since the moment the feed store owner's wife had delivered her information at church. It was not simple anger. Anger was there, clean and manageable, the anger of a mother who has sacrificed and worked and held a standard and watched her son fail to reach it. But underneath the anger was something older and more complicated, something she had been carrying since Garrett died on a Tuesday morning 11 years ago, and she had been required to become everything at once. It was the particular fear of a woman who has built something, a life, a standard, a name in a small town, on the only foundation available to her, which was her own relentless effort, and who understands that the foundation is only as strong as the people who stand on it with her. She had built for Decker as much as for herself. She had built a version of the future in which her son's degree and his decency and his choices justified the second mortgage and the failing truck and the church fundraiser misdirection. She had been building toward something, and now she stood in the frost of a Colorado morning, looking at what had been interrupted, and felt, beneath the anger, beneath the discipline, the particular cold terror of a woman who cannot afford for things to go wrong and has just watched something go wrong. She had also, and this she would not have said aloud to anyone, been thinking about the girl since Sunday afternoon. Sarah Voss. She didn't know her. She had only a name and a town, and the basic facts as delivered by church gossip, which meant she had less than half the truth, and knew it. She was not the kind of woman who judged on half a truth. At least, she tried not to be. But she was also the kind of woman who understood that there was a girl somewhere who was 4 months pregnant and unmarried in 1962 in Colorado, and whose life was being rearranged by the same event that had rearranged her own family's, and the girl's portion of the rearrangement was the harder one. This understanding sat in Corinne like a splinter, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. She had thrown her son out because he had not come to her. Because he had let her hear it from someone else. Because in her world, which was a world built on the idea that you face hard things directly or they destroy you, his silence had been a betrayal of everything she had tried to teach him. But she had not thrown him out because he was wrong for caring about the girl. She had thrown him out to make him go back to the girl and make it right. These were 2 different things. She was not sure he understood the difference. She was not sure, in the long, cold morning of that November, that she had made it clear. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived from Boulder. Not from Decker, from Sarah Voss. It was written on plain white paper in a clear, steady hand, and it was 4 paragraphs long, and it began, "Mrs. Ashwell, you don't know me, and you have a reason to read this, but I was raised to face things directly, and I believe you were too. And so I am writing. Corinne sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light and read the letter twice. Then she sat, for a long time, looking at the window and the bare cottonwood and the road beyond. The letter was not asking for anything. It was not making excuses or appeals or dramatic declarations. It was simply precise. It described the situation as it was. It described Decker as he actually was, in ways that told Corinne this girl had paid attention. It said, near the end, "I don't know what your son is going to do, but I know what I'm going to do, and I thought you should know it too, because it affects your family, and you deserve to hear it from me." The last paragraph said what she was going to do. Corinne read it and set the letter down and pressed both hands flat on the table and felt something move in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. It was not relief exactly. It was something closer to recognition, the feeling you get when you meet someone who is built from the same materials as you, and you know it before you've finished reading the first page of them. She picked up a pen and began to write back. Decker had been sleeping on the couch of his university friend Marsh Calloway for 9 days when Sarah found him there. Marsh was a geology student from Pueblo with a 2-room apartment near campus, and the particular generous chaos of a young man who does not think too hard about inconvenience to himself, and he had let Decker in without questions and continued to ask none, which was either deep tact or incuriosity. Decker could not decide which, and did not care. The apartment smelled of coffee and old socks, and the particular academic disorder of a person who reads seriously and organizes nothing. Decker slept on the couch with his coat over him because the radiator was unreliable and spent his days doing something that looked from the outside like existing and felt from the inside like being suspended in cold water, moving slowly. Not drowning exactly, but not swimming either. He went to his remaining classes because the habit of going was stronger than his current state of mind. He ate when Marsh remembered to ask if he had eaten. He thought about Sarah constantly and called the dormitory twice, and both times she had not been in her room, and he had left no message, because what the message would have said he could not yet compress into something a dormitory phone desk attendant could write on a slip of paper. She came to the apartment on a Wednesday evening, unannounced, wearing her green wool coat and a look on her face that was composed and direct, and told him clearly that she had come here with something specific to say, and intended to say it. Marsh took one look at the two of them, and remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere with an implausibility that would have been comic under different circumstances. Decker and Sarah sat on opposite ends of the couch, his couch, temporarily, the couch that smelled of his exile, and looked at each other with the particular excruciating honesty of two people who have already agreed not to be false with each other and are now required to honor that agreement in the hardest possible conditions. "You haven't called," she said. He said, "I called twice." She said, "I know." "I didn't pick up." He looked at her. "Why?" She said, "Because I needed to know what I was going to do before I talked to you. Because if I talked to you before, I knew your voice would affect what I decided, and I needed to decide it myself." He sat with that. It was, he thought, exactly what she would do. It was exactly why he loved her. It was also, he understood fully in that moment, exactly why she was going to be all right, regardless of what he did next. And this understanding was both the most reassuring and the most frightening thing he had encountered in 9 days of cold water. "What did you decide?" he asked. She told him. She was going to finish her degree. She had 1 semester left. She had spoken to the university women's advisor, a woman named Dr. Parrish, who had seen this situation before and knew the practical landscape of it. She could finish the semester. She had written to her parents, not asked permission, she was careful to use that word, written to them, told them the truth, and her mother had written back in 3 days with a letter that had made her cry in a bathroom stall, and her father had not written back yet, which was his way of needing time. She was going to have the baby. That was decided. What happened after that, with Decca, with all of it? She was not going to decide under pressure or in a dormitory apartment, or with him looking at her the way he was looking at her right now, which she identified precisely and without cruelty as the way people look when they want you to tell them what to do. Decca felt this land with the accuracy of something that has been thrown by someone who knows exactly where you are standing. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to decide what you want," she said. "Not what your mother wants. Not what my father is going to eventually write and say. What you want. And I want you to be honest about it." Then she stood up and put on her coat and left. And Decca sat on the couch in the cold apartment and finally, for the first time in 9 days, began to think clearly. What he thought, sitting in the cold with Marsh's coffee smell and the radiator clicking, was this. He had been waiting for someone to tell him what to do. His mother had told him to leave. He had left. Sarah had told him to decide. He had not decided. He had been suspended in that cold water, waiting for an instruction that would not come, because the instruction this time was not someone else's to give. He was 22 years old. He had been raised by a woman who made decisions alone and made them completely and lived by them entirely. He had watched her do it for 11 years. He had thought, in the abstract way of a person who has been benefiting from someone else's strength without fully examining it, that this capacity for decisive action was simply how his mother was made. Particular to her, not transferable. He understood, sitting on Marsh Calloway's couch in Boulder in November of 1962, that he had been wrong about this. It was not a quality she had been born with. It was a quality she had built, decision by decision, from the materials of her own difficulty. And it was, therefore, it had to be, something he could build too. He got up. He put on his coat. He went to the telephone in the hallway and called the dormitory. And this time Sarah was there, and this time he had something to say. The letter Corinne wrote back to Sarah Voss took 3 attempts and 2 evenings and 1 very early morning to complete, which was unusual for a woman who generally said what she meant in 1 pass without extensive revision. The first attempt ran too long and explained too much, which Corinne recognized as the particular failure of people who are trying to justify themselves rather than communicate. The second attempt was too short and too formal, which she recognized as the opposite failure, the thing you do when you are protecting yourself from the exposure of honesty. The third attempt, written at 4:30 in the morning at the kitchen table with the cattle already audible outside and the coffee going and the bare cottonwood black against the pre-dawn grey, was the right one. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that she had read Sarah's letter twice, and that a woman who writes the way Sarah wrote was a woman who had been raised to respect the truth, and that Corinne respected that. The second paragraph said something that cost her something to write, that she recognized in Sarah's account of events a young woman who had not been careless or dishonest or calculating, and that whatever Corinne's feelings about what had happened, they were not feelings about Sarah's character, because she didn't know Sarah's character, and she intended to be accurate about that distinction. The third paragraph was the one that took the longest. It said, "I threw my son out of this house because he was not honest with me. And in my experience, dishonesty to the people who love you is the beginning of a longer and more damaging dishonesty to yourself. I did not throw him out because of you or because of the child. I threw him out to send him back to where the problem was, because he was here and you were there, and that was the wrong arrangement. I am telling you this because you deserve to know why, and because I believe you are the kind of person who can tell the difference between being punished and being redirected. I hope I am right about that. She addressed the envelope to Sarah Voss at the Boulder dormitory address the girl had included at the bottom of her letter, which was itself a detail. She had included her address, which meant she had expected a response, or at least left room for one. Corinne respected that the way she respected all forward-thinking, practical decisions. She mailed it on a Thursday. Then she went back to the cattle and the frost and the work, which was what she always went back to. Decker called on a Saturday morning, 10 days after he had walked down the porch steps with his suitcase. She heard his voice on the telephone and felt something move in her chest that she did not allow to show in her own voice. He said, "Mama, I want to tell you what I've decided." She said, "Tell me." He was going to marry Sarah Voss. He had asked her. She had said she needed to think about it, which was, he said, the right response, and the one that told him he had asked for the right reason and not just the emergency one. He was going to finish his degree. One semester, like Sarah, they would finish together. He had spoken to the university about his situation, and there were arrangements that could be made. He was going to need... He paused here, and she could hear in the pause the particular difficulty of a young man raised by a proud woman asking a proud woman for help. He was going to need some help. Not much, just some. Just enough to get through the semester while he figured out the next part. Corinne listened to all of this, standing at the kitchen counter with the telephone cord pulled straight, looking out the window at the frost and the cattle and the 40 acres that she had kept by not asking for what she needed until she could not avoid it. "Come home this weekend," she said. "Both of you." A silence. "She'll come," he said. Corinne said, "She will if you ask her properly." She hung up the phone and stood at the window for a moment, and then went to put on a better pot of coffee. The thing she had not told him, the thing she had not told anyone, not Burl, not the women at church, not the bare cottonwood in the front yard, was that she had been thinking about Garrett, about what Garrett would have done. She knew the answer. Garrett would have driven to Boulder the first day. He would have knocked on dormitories and asked questions and found the girl and found his son and sat them both down somewhere warm and sorted it out with the patient gentleness that had been his most essential quality. He would not have thrown anyone out of anywhere. He would have pulled everyone closer. She knew this, and she knew also that she was not Garrett, had never been Garrett, had become something different in the 11 years since he died, something harder and more effective and lonelier. She had made decisions she believed in. She did not doubt the decision about Decker, but she held Garrett's ghost in the kitchen that Saturday morning and let herself acknowledge, just briefly, just privately, that his way had things in it that hers did not. Then she put on her coat and went out to the cattle, because the cattle needed feeding regardless of what any ghost had to say about it, and this was, and had always been, the fundamental fact of her life. The letter Corinne wrote back to Sarah Voss took 3 attempts and 2 evenings and 1 very early morning to complete, which was unusual for a woman who generally said what she meant in 1 pass without extensive revision. The first attempt ran too long and explained too much, which Corinne recognized as the particular failure of people who are trying to justify themselves rather than communicate. The second attempt was too short and too formal, which she recognized as the opposite failure. the thing you do when you are protecting yourself from the exposure of honesty. The third attempt, written at 4:30 in the morning at the kitchen table with the cattle already audible outside and the coffee going and the bare cottonwood black against the pre-dawn grey, was the right one. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that she had read Sarah's letter twice, and that a woman who writes the way Sarah wrote was a woman who had been raised to respect the truth, and that Corinne respected that. The second paragraph said something that cost her something to write, that she recognized in Sarah's account of events a young woman who had not been careless or dishonest or calculating, and that whatever Corinne's feelings about what had happened, they were not feelings about Sarah's character, because she did not know Sarah's character, and she intended to be accurate about that distinction. The third paragraph was the one that took the longest. It said, "I threw my son out of this house because he was not honest with me, and in my experience, dishonesty to the people who love you is the beginning of a longer and more damaging dishonesty to yourself. I did not throw him out because of you or because of the child. I threw him out to send him back to where the problem was, because he was here and you were there, and that was the wrong arrangement. I am telling you this because you deserve to know why, and because I believe you are the kind of person who can tell the difference between being punished and being redirected. I hope I am right about that." She addressed the envelope to Sarah Voss at the Boulder dormitory, a dress the girl had included at the bottom of her letter, which was itself a detail. She had included her address, which meant she had expected a response, or at least left room for one. Corinne respected that the way she respected all forward-thinking, practical decisions. She mailed it on a Thursday. Then she went back to the cattle and the frost and the work, which was what she always went back to. Decker called on a Saturday morning, 10 days after he had walked down the porch steps with his suitcase. She heard his voice on the telephone and felt something move in her chest that she did not allow to show in her own voice. He said, "Mama, I want to tell you what I've decided." She said, "Tell me." He was going to marry Sarah Voss. He had asked her. She had said she needed to think about it, which was, he said, the right response, and the one that told him he had asked for the right reason, and not just the emergency one. He was going to finish his degree. 1 semester, like Sarah. They would finish together. He had spoken to the university about his situation, and there were arrangements that could be made. He was going to need... He paused here, and she could hear in the pause the particular difficulty of a young man raised by a proud woman asking a proud woman for help. He was going to need some help. Not much, just some. Just enough to get through the semester while he figured out the next part. Corinne listened to all of this, standing at the kitchen counter with the telephone cord pulled straight, looking out the window at the frost and the cattle and the 40 acres that she had kept by not asking for what she needed until she could not avoid it. "Come home this weekend," she said. "Both of you." A silence. "She'll come," he said. Corinne said, "She will if you ask her properly." She hung up the phone and stood at the window for a moment, and then went to put on a better pot of coffee. The thing she had not told him, the thing she had not told anyone, not Burl, not the women at church, not the bare cottonwood in the front yard, was that she had been thinking about Garrett, about what Garrett would have done. She knew the answer. Garrett would have driven to Boulder the first day. He would have knocked on dormitories and asked questions, and found the girl and found his son, and sat them both down somewhere warm, and sorted it out with the patient gentleness that had been his most essential quality. He would not have thrown anyone out of anywhere. He would have pulled everyone closer. She knew this, and she knew also that she was not Garrett, had never been Garrett, had become something different in the 11 years since he died, something harder and more effective and lonelier. She had made decisions she believed in. She did not doubt the decision about Decker, but she held Garrett's ghost in the kitchen that Saturday morning and let herself acknowledge, just briefly, just privately, that his way had things in it that hers did not. Then she put on her coat and went out to the cattle, because the cattle needed feeding regardless of what any ghost had to say about it, and this was, and had always been, the fundamental fact of her life. They arrived on a Friday evening in Decker's borrowed truck, coming up the main road of Millhaven, with the San Juan Mountains going dark against the last of the sky behind them. Sarah had never been to Millhaven. She looked out the passenger window at the single-lit main street and the feed store and the church with its leaning steeple, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "It's like Gunnison." Decker glanced at her. "Is that good or bad?" She considered this honestly. "It means I understand it," she said, "which is something." They pulled up in front of the house, with the cottonwood in the front yard and the porch light on, yellow and steady this time, not the flickering, uncertain thing it had been on the night of the suitcase. And before Decker could say anything preparatory or cautionary, the front door opened and Corinne came out onto the porch. Not dramatically. Not with the crossed arms and the set jaw. She came out in her regular clothes with her hands at her sides, and she stood at the edge of the porch light and looked at the truck and at the two people getting out of it. Sarah got out first. She was 5 months along now, and beginning to show in a way that a coat could still mostly conceal, but could not completely. She stood by the truck and looked at Corinne Ashwell on the porch, and Corinne looked at her, and for a moment the two women simply took each other's measure in the way that women who have been reading each other through letters sometimes do when the paper finally becomes a person, checking whether the person matches the impression, whether the handwriting and the face are telling the same story. They were. Corinne came down the 3 porch steps and crossed the yard and stopped 2 feet from Sarah Voss and said, "I'm glad you came." Sarah said, "I wasn't sure I should." Corinne said, "That's the right instinct. The right answer is still come." Then she looked at her son, who was standing on the other side of the truck, holding his hat in his hands, like a man appearing before a judge, and said, "Put that hat on your head, Decker. You look like a defendant." He put it on. The smallest thing relaxed in the night air. They went inside. Corinne had cooked. This was the thing that Sarah would remember and tell people for the rest of her life as the detail that told her everything she needed to know about Corinne Ashwell. Not the letter, not the directness, but the cooking. Because a woman who cooks for someone she has not forgiven yet is a woman who has already decided to try, who has made the effort before the feeling has caught up, who believes that you build the bridge first and the trust walks across it after. There was a roast and there were potatoes and there was a pie that was not as good as Betsy Voss's pie, but was made with the same intention. And they sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and ate. The conversation was careful at first, the kind of careful that has manners in it rather than pretense, the carefulness of people who are dealing with something real and do not want to damage it with carelessness. Corinne asked Sarah about her degree. Sarah told her about it, the law focus, the plans that had been adjusted, the plans that were being rebuilt. Corinne listened the way she always listened, completely, and then said, "What do you want to do with a law degree from a mountain state in 1963? And Sarah, who had been asked this question by various people with various degrees of skepticism, and had learned to read the flavor of the asking, heard in Corinne's version of it not skepticism, but genuine inquiry, and answered honestly, and the conversation moved, and by the time the pie was on the table, something in the room had shifted from careful to real. After dinner, Corinne and Sarah sat at the kitchen table with coffee while Decker went out to walk the cattle perimeter. Sent there, both women understood, so that they could talk without him. Corinne poured coffee and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer the same way you wrote." Sarah said, "All right." Corinne said, "Do you love my son?" Not are you sure, or is this the right thing, or have you thought about what this means? Just the question, set down without decoration. Sarah looked at her coffee, and then at Corinne's face, and said, "Yes. I wish the timing was different. I wish we had more time before this happened. But the yes is the same, regardless of the timing." Corinne nodded slowly, once in the way that meant she had received an answer she considered adequate. Then she said, "He's not his father, in most ways. His father was gentler. Decker has more of me than I would have chosen for him." Sarah said, "I know. That's not the part that worries me." Corinne looked at her. "What is?" Sarah said, "Whether he knows how to need people. Your son is very good at being needed. I'm not sure he knows how to need." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, faint, the sound of cattle and a man's footsteps on cold ground. Corinne wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "No," she said slowly. "He doesn't. I didn't teach him that. I didn't know how to teach it." This was, for Corinne Ashwell, an extraordinary thing to say. Sarah understood this, and did not treat it lightly. "You're teaching it now," she said, "by letting us come." Corinne looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since October, something in her face that had been very tightly held let go, just slightly, just enough. The letter from Sarah's father arrived in Boulder on the 14th day after Sarah had told her parents, long enough that she had begun to understand the silence as its own message, and short enough that it had not yet cured into permanent estrangement. Milo Voss was not a man who wrote easily. His handwriting showed this, each letter formed with the deliberate effort of someone more comfortable with a hardware invoice than a personal letter. The letter was 2 pages. The first page was the expected thing. Sarah had prepared herself for it, and read it with her hands flat on the desk and her breathing steady. Disappointment. The word responsibility used 4 times, a reference to what people in Gunnison would say, which told her more about her father's fear than about his moral judgment. A sentence about the scholarship and whether she had considered what this meant for it, that she had, in fact, considered entirely and had already addressed, and which she allowed to sit without argument, because arguing with her father's letter was not a conversation. It was an echo. She read the first page and turned it over. The second page was different. It began mid-thought, as if he had written the first page, and then sat for a while, and then started again from a different place. It said, "Your mother read me your letter out loud at the kitchen table because she said I needed to hear your voice in it, not just the words. She was right. I heard you." Then it said that Betsy Voss had told him, apparently with some force, that the measure of a parent was not what they did when things were easy, a truth Milo admitted he had been losing sight of. It said that he was not going to Gunnison on Sunday, and that what people in Gunnison said was going to have to manage itself. It said, and this was the sentence Sarah read 3 times, pressing the paper flat with both thumbs, "I built a hardware store from nothing, because your grandfather told me I couldn't, and I wanted to prove something. You are going to do something harder than that. I want to see it." It was not an embrace. Milo Voss was not a man who wrote embraces, but it was, unmistakably, a door opening. Sarah sat at her desk and let herself feel it. The full, complicated relief of a father who is turning toward you when he could have kept his back. She had not cried when she found out she was pregnant. She had not cried when Decker had gone to his mother's and come back without her. She cried now, alone in her dormitory room with her father's careful handwriting in her hands, cried with the particular release of someone who has been holding their breath for 3 weeks and has finally been told it is safe to exhale. The semester ground forward the way, forward. Semesters do, relentlessly, without regard for personal circumstances, piling work and deadlines on top of everything else with the impersonal efficiency of a system that does not make allowances. Sarah completed her coursework. Some of it was hard in ways that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. The constitutional law seminar she was determined to finish, the thesis chapter she had been working on for a year, and which she was not going to let this semester erase. Some of it was hard in ways that had everything to do with it. The exhaustion, the physical weight of the growing child, the day in November when she sat in a lecture hall and could not write notes for 20 minutes, because the baby kicked so hard and so steadily that she could not hold a thought still. She sat with her pen unmoving and felt the life inside her making its presence known to her, insistently, and thought, "You are the most inconvenient and most real thing that has ever happened to me." This seemed accurate enough to serve as a kind of peace with it. She went back to her notes. She did not miss another lecture. Decker, for his part, was becoming something. This was the unexpected development of those late months, that the crisis had required him to build the thing Sarah had named in Corinne's kitchen, the capacity to need, which meant the capacity to say so, which required a particular kind of courage that was different from the courage his mother had modeled, and perhaps harder for him because of it. He had told the truth to his academic advisor, and been treated with more practical compassion than he had expected. He had asked Marsh for help, and accepted it without performing gratitude so extreme it created distance. He had called his mother every Sunday, not because she asked him to, but because he had decided to, and in those calls he had begun, cautiously, imperfectly, to talk to her the way Sarah talked to him, which was directly and without the protective performance of someone managing someone else's expectations. Corinne had responded to this with the dry, steady engagement of a woman who recognizes a real conversation and knows better than to ruin it by commenting on the fact of it. They were building something new between them on the ground of something old, and neither of them said so, and both of them knew it. The baby was due in late March. The question of what happened after graduation, where they would live, how they would live, what work meant, what money meant, what the 40 acres in Millhaven meant, and what the hardware store in Gunnison meant, had not been fully answered. It was ahead of them like the San Juan Mountains, visible and large and requiring crossing. But they were, for the first time since October, facing the same direction. The baby came early. This is the thing that life does. It does not wait for the conditions you have assembled to be fully ready, does not hold itself until the thesis is finished and the ceremony is done, and the question of where do we live has been resolved. Life comes when it comes. Sarah went into labor on a Thursday morning in early March, 6 weeks before the due date, in the university library, where she had been working on her final thesis chapter with the focused determination of a woman who has decided that the thesis will be finished before the baby arrives and has not yet received the baby's opinion on this schedule. Decker was in a lecture across campus. She did not call him first. She called the University Health Clinic, and then she called Betsy Voss in Gunnison, who said, "I'm coming," before Sarah finished the sentence. And then she sat in the library bathroom and breathed carefully and waited for the world to reorganize itself around this new and immediate fact. Decker arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after Sarah, still in his lecture coat, out of breath, with the look on his face of a man who has been running physically and emotionally at the same time. He came into the room and took Sarah's hand, and she looked at him and said, "6 weeks early," in a voice that was controlled, but had something underneath it that was not. "Is it—" he started. The nurse in the room said, "Baby's position is good. We're watching closely. Breathe." He breathed. Sarah breathed. The labor was long. Betsy Voss arrived from Gunnison at 11 that night, having driven the mountain road in the dark, in a way that she would later describe only as urgently. She came into the room small and warm and practical, and smelling of the hardware store, a smell Sarah had associated her whole life with her father's work and her mother's proximity to it. And she took her daughter's face in both hands and said, "There you are," which was the exact right thing in a way that required no explanation. Corinne arrived at midnight. Nobody had called her. She had called the apartment looking for Decker, and Marsh had told her what he knew, and she had gotten in the truck and driven the 4 hours from Millhaven in the dark, because she was Corinne Ashwell, and when there was something that needed to be done, you did it, and did not require an invitation. She came into the hospital hallway in her work coat with her hair loose, which Decker had never seen, and she walked to where he was standing outside the room and stood next to him and looked at the door and said, "How is she?" He said, "They're watching. It's early." Corinne nodded. She stood beside him in the hallway and did not say anything else, and he stood beside her, and they waited together in the fluorescent hospital quiet. At some point, he could not have said when, he had reached for her hand, and she had let him take it and held it with both of hers. This was the first time in his adult life that he could remember his mother holding his hand, and it not feeling like something he should be past. It felt, in the stripped-down clarity of a hospital hallway at midnight, like the most necessary thing in the world. The baby was born at 4:17 in the morning. A girl. Small, startlingly, frighteningly small. The way early babies are, all the essential parts compressed into an urgent package that the body has delivered before it was quite ready, but breathing and loud about it, which the doctor said with visible relief was a very good sign. Decker saw her first, over the doctor's shoulder, and what happened to his face in that moment was something that Betsy Voss, who was watching from the corner of the room, would describe to Milo later as the face of a man who has just understood what he is for. Sarah held her daughter, their daughter, with the careful intensity of someone holding the most breakable and most durable thing simultaneously, which is precisely what a new life is. The baby had dark hair, which was Decker's, and a look of concentrated seriousness, which could have been either of them. She was 4 pounds and 11 ounces, and she was already completely herself. Corinne stood in the doorway of the hospital room and looked at the three of them. Her son, this girl she had written 2 letters to, and cooked a roast for, and was beginning to understand she was going to love, and the small life that was the reason for everything that had happened since October. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked to the chair by the bed and sat down and said, "What will you name her?" And Sarah looked up from her daughter's face and said, "We thought Garrett, if it had been a boy." She paused. "For a girl, we thought Nell." Corinne sat very still. Nell had been her own mother's name. She had not told Decker this in years. She looked at her son. He looked back at her steadily. "Sarah found it in the letter you wrote her," he said quietly. "The one you signed. Corinne Nell Ashwell." The room was very quiet. Outside, the Colorado, dark was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to become morning. Spring came to Millhaven the way it always did, reluctantly, in stages, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes like something that does not admit defeat, but simply changes position. By April, the frost was gone from the fence wire, and the cattle were moving with more energy in the east field, and the cottonwood in the front yard was putting out its first thin leaves, pale green and tentative, the color of a beginning. Corinne stood on the porch in the early morning with her coffee and looked at the 40 acres and felt the particular quality of an April morning that she had been feeling for 20 years, the specific mixture of relief and renewed demand that comes with the land waking up again and requiring everything you have to give it. The difference this April was that she was not standing on the porch alone. Decker and Sarah had graduated in late March, 3 days before Nell came home from the hospital. Small, still, but strong enough, cleared by the doctor with the specific instructions of a man who has learned to be precise when dealing with the parents of early babies, and does not want them calling him in a panic over something manageable. They had argued, carefully, about where to go next, which is the argument that stands behind all arguments between two people trying to build a life from the materials of two different places. Sarah's law degree had possibilities in Denver. There were firms, there were openings, there was the future she had planned before the library, and the labor and the 417 morning. Decker had the 40 acres, and the cattle, and a mother who had kept both through 11 years of alone. They had sat with it, the two of them, in the way they sat with hard things, directly, without performance, each one saying what they actually meant, rather than what was easier to say. In the end, it was Sarah who had suggested, with the practicality that was her most essential quality, that the answer might not be a choice between two things, but a construction from both. Denver was 3 hours from Millhaven. A law firm was a possibility in the future. The land was a reality in the present. The present, she said, looking at Nell in her arms with the calm of a woman who has been reorganized by love and is making her peace with the new arrangement, required what it required. They moved into the Millhaven house in April. Corinne gave them the large bedroom and took the smaller one without discussion, which was how Corinne did things, moving them before they could become negotiations. She gave Sarah the kitchen without discussion either, which surprised Sarah until she understood that it was not an abdication, but a gift. The kitchen had been Corinne's domain for 20 years, and releasing it was an act of trust delivered in the language of practical generosity that Corinne spoke better than any other. They were not always easy with each other. Corinne had opinions, and she expressed them, and Sarah had the particular brand of patience that has steel in it. She could receive an opinion completely and set it down unchanged without either arguing or capitulating, and this drove Corinne slightly mad in a way that she gradually came to understand was respect. Decker worked the cattle with Burl, who was 66 now and slower but no less precise, and began to learn the things his mother had learned alone, that he should have started learning at 12. He was a slow student in the ways that matter, the patience for fence line, the rhythm of cattle, the long, unglamorous arithmetic of land maintenance. But he was willing, and willingness, Burl told him once, was rarer than talent and worth considerably more in the end. Nell grew. This was the primary fact of that year, the organizing event around which everything else arranged itself, that a small and urgent life was getting larger and more insistent and more, specifically herself every week, and that 3 adults and an elderly ranch hand were in various states of besottedness about it. Corinne held Nell in the mornings when Sarah was studying for the bar exam, which she had decided to take, and which required the kitchen table in the afternoons and large portions of Corinne's patience in the mornings while Sarah worked. Corinne held the baby with the particular ease of a woman who has not held a baby in 20 years and has not forgotten how, walking slow laps of the kitchen and the porch and the front yard, while Nell looked at the world with Garrett Ashwell's serious dark eyes and seemed to find it moderately acceptable. Burl came by one morning and found Corinne on the porch with Nell against her shoulder and said carefully, "She's got the look of someone who's going to have opinions." Corinne looked down at the small, serious face. "Good," she said. "Opinions are useful." Milo Voss came in June. He drove from Gunnison, in his hardware store truck, alone, because Betsy had come twice already and told him it was his turn. He stood in the front yard of the Millhaven house with his hat in his hands, just like his son-in-law had stood on a night that now felt like a different world, and looked at the 40 acres and the cottonwood and the woman who came out onto the porch to meet him, and something passed between 2 parents who had never met, but had both done something they had to live with, and had both watched their children survive it. Corinne came down the 3 steps and offered her hand. Milo took it. "Your daughter is remarkable," Corinne said, without preamble, because it was true, and he needed to hear it from someone who was not obligated to say it by love. Milo held her hand a moment and said, "So is your son." Then they went inside, where Sarah was at the table with her law books, and Decker was coming in from the field with mud on his boots, and Nell was in the wooden cradle that had been in the corner of the bedroom, and that Corinne had brought out, without a word, and set in the kitchen where the light was good and the family was. Milo Voss sat down at the kitchen table and took off his hat and looked at his granddaughter, and the look on his face was the one that Betsy had predicted and that he had refused to admit was coming, and it was total, and it was permanent. On a Friday evening in late June, when Nell was 3 months old and beginning to have a sense of humor about the world that Sarah recognized as her father's, and Decker recognized as his mother's, and Corinne recognized as its own entirely original thing, the family sat on the porch in the long summer evening, with the San Juan Mountains going gold in the last of the light. Corinne held Nell. Decker sat on the porch rail. Sarah leaned against the doorframe with her coffee cup and looked at the cottonwood, fully leafed now, thick and green and moving in the small evening wind. She thought about what she would say in 20 years when Nell asked her about this story, the library and the labor and the long October night and the letter she had written to a woman she had never met, because she had been raised to face things directly. She thought about what she would say about Corinne. She was still working on the words. Some things, she was learning, did not compress into sentences easily. Some things were better shown in the way you hold a baby on a June evening, in the way you walk down 3 porch steps toward someone who has come, in the way you let a woman into your kitchen and your house and the mornings of your life because you have read her handwriting and you trust what you have read. Corinne looked up from Nell's face and across the porch to Sarah, and something moved between them that was not a word and did not need to be. Nell made a small decisive sound and grabbed Corinne's finger with her whole fist. The mountains went gold and then pink and then the deep blue of a Colorado summer ending. The cottonwood moved, the cattle settled in the east field, and whatever had been broken in October had become, by the long work of honesty and time and people willing to keep going, something that was not broken at all, something stronger in the cracked places, which is always how the strongest things are made.